Hi, I'm Amber Shepherd. I'm a family history enthusiast. I've been using Ancestry for a number of years to trace my family tree. I'm going to be sharing with you some of my tips and tricks for doing this. I'm hoping that whether you're a beginner to Ancestry or whether you've been using it for a while, that this will be of use to you and that you'll get something from it. I've also included a few little tricks outside of Ancestry as well. So just a quick overview on what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to discuss with you a bit about growing your family tree, so where to start, how to find new information for your tree, and a little bit about how to confirm that the stuff that you're finding is actually to do with your family members and not someone else. I'm also going to talk about some links outside of Ancestry, as I mentioned, and also a bit about how to find the history of your home, who lived there before you. So you might be familiar with the structure of a family tree. You're like the seed of the tree, and then from this branches out the family tree. So before you, your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, so on, sort of going back. And this is how you'll start your tree on Ancestry. It will start with you, and you'll start inputting information to build this tree just with stuff that you know. So the first step is to start adding all of the information that you know. You'll start with yourself. As I said, you're the seed of the tree, and just any information that you have, and then any information you have about your parents, you'll add them as like members of your tree, and then your grandparents, and so on and so on. And the more information that you can put in at this stage, the easier you're going to make it for yourself. Something to note though, if you have absolutely no information about anyone else in your tree, of course it is going to be harder to build your family tree, but one thing that you could try is that Ancestry offer this service where you can send off a swab of your DNA and they can actually look at their other customers and try and find links, and they can actually tell from your DNA how you're related to other people on the website as long as they've also done a test. So you might be able to find, say, a first cousin, and then you can look at their tree and try and find where they link to someone else that's related to you, and you might be able to link things up and find people that you're likely to be related to that way. But in general, it's good to just add as much information as you know at this stage, and then you can start trying to look for records to build your tree. Something that's worth noting when you're inputting your information is that censuses only go back to 1939 right now. This is to do with laws around what information can be shared because of privacy. So I think in general it's something like 100 years, but there is this other 1939 census that you can find. But anything more recent than that exists, it just hasn't been released yet. So for this reason, it's quite useful if you can put in information about relatives who lived a longer time ago, because you're going to find more records about them because they're legally allowed to be released now. If you don't have information that far back, that's fine, you can still find things. It's just going to help you out. If you do have that information, do put it in, do have it jotted down. And I mean, things like birth years, marriage years, birthplaces are really useful for finding records, but really anything can end up being useful. Little anecdotes about, say, what they might have done as a job, because that might be on a census, or really just anything might be a clue later on to be able to work out whether someone you're seeing is likely to be your relative. So what you're going to do is start inputting this information, and there might be some clues that you sort of have from other places. So for example, this is my great-grandmother Vera on my Ancestry tree, and as you can see, I've been able to put in her birthday and year, where she was born, when she died, and also the names of her parents. And actually I was able to make these links because of family information. I asked my mum, she knew her grandmother's birthday, she knew when her grandmother had died, and she also knew her grandmother's maiden name, and I think also the name Ashby was something that she was familiar with. She knew that that had been a family name. So being able to talk to her about the memories she had was really useful in being able to tell that some of these records link together. So the next step is to find some records, so things like censuses and birth certificates, to start really putting together clues and linking people together to build your tree. So the way you'll do this initially is you'll go to members in your tree that you want to find records relating to, and you'll either go to the hints button that I've highlighted here or this search button. The search button is a lot easier to use when you've actually found a bit more information. So I would initially start with the hints if you have some hints, and essentially Ancestry will look at the information you've given it and try and find the most likely records. And a top tip for this is, one, get a pen and paper ready, because if you're going through record after record, it quickly becomes difficult to remember what names you saw on this census and when they were born, and it's really good to just note things down. And in a similar way, maybe have multiple tabs open on your computer with different records, because it's really important to cross-reference things to check that things match up, because sometimes you can find a record that actually looks like it really matches someone, but ultimately it's a different person and it's just a coincidence, and that does happen. So you really want to match up as much as you can. So the types of records that you might have, and I'll go through them in a bit more detail, but there are censuses, so essentially a record of where people were on a certain night of the year and what their jobs were when they were born, and members of families. I would say this is one of the most useful pieces of information because it has quite a lot of details about the person, and you can kind of follow them through time in this way. But also things like marriage, birth and death certificates, they give you dates and names. Military records, there are all sorts of types of military records and they all have different information in them. I don't think I've seen every type of military record there is to find, but I have found a wide range. So they're really useful. But then also things like newspaper articles and criminal records, a little bit rarer to find, but gives you some really interesting context about your relative, because it's a little bit more of an insight into their life maybe than just when they were born and what they did for a job. So censuses, here's an example of a 1901 census. So you see you have all these columns with different types of information in them. The first column is the road or the street. So usually at the top there will be the name of the street and then it will be numbered, and then each house sort of corresponds to who was there and the details about them. They often will omit the street name after the top entry of the record, so you just need to look at the top to find out which street you're on. And then the next column is telling you whether anyone is living there. Probably less useful for building your tree, to be honest, that part. But then you've got the name and surname, and this is for each member of the family. And then next to that, it tells you their relation to the head of the household. So in every household there will be a head. Usually this will be, say, the father/husband in the family, the oldest male in the house, or sometimes if it's a single mother, would be the mother. It's usually one of the two. And then you'll see, so like here, you've got the person Edwin Shepherd as head of the household, and then afterwards Edwin's wife, and then son, and then etc. until you get to the next house. Sometimes you find some interesting relationships here. Sometimes you'll find like a sister-in-law or father-in-law, and that can be really useful for them finding other members of the family. So it's really useful to look at who people are living with, even if it's got someone listed as a lodger. Quite useful to jot that name down, because maybe you'll find them elsewhere in the records. They could be a distant relative, they could be someone who they work with, so it is useful to jot it down. It could be a clue for later. And then it tells you if they're married or not, again, this can be quite useful because marriage certificates can have quite a lot of information on. So being able to tell whether someone is married between one census and another might be able to narrow down dates for searching for a marriage certificate, for example. And then age, again, very useful. You can use this to work out their birth year. Ancestry will often try and do this for you actually, so it will look at when the census was from and how old the person was and give you an estimate of the birth year. Of course, this depends a little bit the month they were born in and the month the census took place in, so you have to remember that this can be out by, you know, a year or so. So just bear that in mind when you're trying to work out whether this is the person you're looking for. Profession is a really interesting one. It doesn't always help you find people. It can, because of course you can look from census to census and see, is this person doing the same job, and then that's a good clue that it's the same person that you found. But ultimately it's quite interesting to know what your family members did as a job, and something I like to do is sometimes look up these jobs and find out a little bit about what it was like to do that job, because it sort of puts you in their shoes a little bit. Employment details, again, definitely worth looking at everything on a record you find, but I think this tends to be less useful in building your tree. Where born, very useful, because this is going to help you if you're looking for a birth certificate. Sometimes people move and then it makes it really difficult to find them. So if you are looking for someone, trying to gather records on them, it's worth trying to look for them in a census to find out where they were born, to then be able to try and track down their birth certificate. There's also this column at the end, not worded very sensitively, but essentially it's asking if they are deaf, or whether they are blind, or whether they have any disabilities. It's just not worded very nicely. I've actually never seen this column filled in all of my time looking at these censuses, but I'm sure that sometimes they are. And in terms of using censuses, it's a really good idea to cross-reference, as I mentioned earlier. So what I would tend to do is, if I think I've found a trail for someone, so here I'm following John H. Hills around, and what's a really good thing to do is to look at all of them next to each other, look at the names and the ages. So you can see, as you follow these censuses through, then John H. Hills is on all of these censuses. I realise the last one says Hyder, I will get to that in a moment, but you can see the age is increasing in 10 years, just like the years between the censuses. And then here is Anne Hills, or Anne Hyder, who is also the correct age in every census. And then if you look, a number of the children are also seen census to census, so you can really see this is the same family that you're following through time. It's quite interesting here, as I said, so in the 1911 census, suddenly this family changes their name to Hyder, and ordinarily this could make them quite difficult to find, because of course the name has completely changed. So you might see, you know, a suggestion for a John Henry Hyder and think, but that's not the name of the person I'm following. But I think I found this because Ancestry essentially suggested it to me, probably because it noticed all of the same names and ages, because Ancestry can look for patterns like that, and that's how it comes up with these hints that it will give you. And so when I was able to compare, I realised that there was a really strong chance that these were the right people, and I was actually able to find records later on that confirmed this as well. So definitely worth doing this, and definitely worth not discounting people just because they have a different name. Definitely worth doing a bit of detective work to work out whether this is actually your family member. So on to marriage certificates. There's a couple of different types of sort of marriage records you might find. So there's the marriage index, which can be useful as long as you know both of the spouse's names and the marriage year and the place. So essentially you need to already know all of the information to find this. So it's good to add to your family tree, but won't always give you new information. I think though from this you may be able to order the marriage certificate online, so in that way it could also be useful if you're willing to do that. I've never done that myself, but yeah, ultimately you do kind of need the information to find this one. Far more useful is the proper certificate, because this has quite a lot of information on it, and you can often just from a couple of pieces of information find this and then get a whole lot more information. So a marriage certificate is going to tell you the exact date that they were married. It's going to tell you the wife's maiden name. It's going to tell you both of the married couple's professions at the time that they were married. It will also tell you their condition, which can be useful because, for example, if one of them had already been married and had been widowed, this would be written on the certificate, and this might be a good clue if you've been following them in the censuses, say, to work out where a spouse has gone. Also tells you their address, again, can be cross-referenced with a census to try and work out if this is the same person you've been following. And it also tells you the father's name and profession, and again, this is stuff that you might have seen on a census, so a really good clue to try and link people together. If you haven't seen a census yet, maybe you could use this to say find the parent of someone, because now you have their address and you have their profession, so you may be able to look at a marriage certificate and find someone's parents and then follow them through the censuses and so on. What's quite interesting here, there's the bit at the bottom that says in the presence of us, so the people who witnessed the marriage, and actually both of these are family members. You can see Ernest John Allfrey, so same surname, so that was one way to sort of link people together, but actually Nellie Smith is also a family member. In fact, Nellie Smith is Vera Smith, the bride's mother. So again, a good way to sort of corroborate that I found her parents correctly. So birth and death certificates, another type of record that you might find, very common record to find on Ancestry, and essentially it does exactly what it says. It certifies the birth or the death of someone, so it will give you the date and a few other bits of information. So for example, here we have this is actually a baptism certificate, which is also quite useful because baptisms would often happen quite soon after the birth, so you can get a vague idea of when they were born. But something that you get from a baptism or a birth certificate is the name of the parents, which again, because you're trying to sort of move upwards in a tree as you build it, you're working from yourself and then going back in time, being able to jump back a generation like this may be exactly what you need to move forward. You also get things like their address, again, really useful if you're looking for censuses, and even the trade of the father, which again can be looked at on censuses. And also, even if you reach a dead end in your family tree but you manage to find the profession of this family member and the name, it still gives you that insight into their life, which is quite a nice thing to have. And then military records, which there are a surprising number of different types of. So as I said, I don't think I've seen every different type there is. Common types are enlistment forms, where people signed up to join the army. So here we've got a certificate from my great-grandfather who's signing up to be in the army. And it's quite interesting because there's sort of a declaration that he's had to sign here, which feels a little bit almost personal. It's like a little insight into a part of his life in a way, but it also has some pretty useful pieces of information. So it's got his address on there, it's got his name on there, and so this is all stuff that I can then use to try and find censuses or link with a census. It's also worth noting down the regimental number if you see it on a record. This can be used to find other military records, and it also can be used to, say, find a war grave if your relative passed away during the war. So I did this for someone else's family tree, and I was able to find a photo of the grave which actually had an inscription from the wife of the soldier who had died, which is again a really personal thing to find and to be able to share with someone about their family member. And then a little bit rarer, you can find newspaper articles on Ancestry. So actually, the example on the left here, I will talk a bit about this example later because this was a time where I sort of went outside of Ancestry to find something, but this actually wasn't on Ancestry. But the other two examples are newspaper clippings from Ancestry, and you can kind of do a couple of things with this. I mean, you probably won't find huge clues for building your tree, but you might, so it's definitely worth looking at a newspaper if it's got some relative information about your relative. For example, if your relative had a job that they might have advertised in the newspaper. I have seen that before where someone was, I think maybe a plumber or a mason, and they were advertising their services in their local newspaper. And that was both useful for being able to work out their profession, which again is on censuses, but also that was their advert, and that's quite special to be able to see that from a family member. But as you can see here, you know, lots of different things you might see in a newspaper, but it is a little bit rarer and can be a little bit harder to sort of clarify whether this is really to do with your relative or not, because it often won't have a lot of information about the person. The other thing that you may stumble upon, and I have a couple of times, are criminal records. So in criminal records, it will tell you the name of the person, it will tell you the sentence, and it will tell you their age at the time. So it is difficult to confirm whether the person you found is definitely the person you've been following, the person from your tree, because essentially you've only really got their name and you've got their age, so you can work out a birth year and a name and a general location, but of course these trials would have happened in one place, sort of from people living all around the area, so it's not super easy to work out whether it's just someone with the same name of a similar age. But I tend to add these to my records and then just take them with a pinch of salt. But I mean, something you could look for is if they were, say, given a long prison sentence, you would expect them to perhaps disappear from the censuses. So there are ways that you might be able to confirm that this is your family member. But as you can see here, this particular member of someone else's family tree, but they were in prison for 3 months, so that's not long enough to see them disappear from a census. But I still added it to the record, and it's interesting, but we don't know if it really was them. So, okay, those are all of the records, and I have touched on how you might want to think about them as you're finding them. But essentially the way it works is you're acting like a detective and you're trying to piece together all of these clues to build your family tree. So this is just an example of how things might go. It really depends on what records you find first and how you sort of piece it all together. But for example, you might start with a census. So now you've got the name, the spouse's name, and the date of birth of the person that you're focusing on right now, where you've gone from their profile and you're looking through hints and you found the census. Okay, great. So now, because you have the name of them and their spouse and their dates of birth, you can search for, say, a marriage certificate with which will give you the father's name and the address and occupation of the father. So let's say that you can find that using that information you got from the census. Now you can use the father's name, address, and occupation to find a census with the father on it. So if, for example, the spouse had been living with the father just before marriage, there might be a census of them living in that address. and you'll be able to corroborate this by looking at both of their birth years. And then if you find that census, you might find the mother's name, you might find the siblings' names, and then maybe you follow those censuses through the years and find someone else, or you find, as it says here, like the marriage certificate of the parents, and you just keep following it back. So essentially it does depend on what you can find, but every record you find is a series of clues that you can then use to look for other records that will give you more clues, etc., etc. And if you reach a dead end, maybe just move on to another part of your tree if you can. This often happens to me, and then either Ancestry finds something in the meantime, or I come back to it with sort of a fresh mind where I can maybe look for something in a bit of a different way, and then I have a breakthrough. The key is really just to keep a really good record of everyone, both on Ancestry, but also I tend to write things down on a piece of paper. I have something with their name, and then I write down their birthday and just little details about them all on a piece of paper. And only add things to the tree when you're quite sure that that is the person, or your tree is going to become quite quickly muddled with maybe wrong information, and then the more wrong information you add, the more lost you're going to get, and then the harder it is to sort of backtrack and find the right information. So really only when you've got a strong case for something would I add it to your Ancestry tree, and would I add it to your piece of paper. Maybe if you're not sure, just put a question mark. It is good to be cautious with these things, or you can quickly kind of ruin your family tree. So when you've got a bit of information, or maybe when there are no hints or you've hit a dead end, this is where the search tool might be very useful to you. So what you do is, there are sort of a couple of ways to use the search tool. You can just search all records and just type in the information and just sort of trawl through and see what you find. You can also go to the profile of a family member and search from them, and it will input all of their details. So let's say you want to put in some information yourself. So this is what the screen is going to look like for you, and you basically are just going to put in all of the information that you have. I mean, you can be more specific, so if you're looking for a very particular kind of record, then maybe you just focus on the pieces of information that you would want to find in that record, just to make it sort of more precise to what you're looking for. But in general, I tend to just put in everything I know. So here I've started with the name, so I know exactly their name, so I've ticked exact. But if you're not sure, don't tick exact, and either just leave things blank that you don't know, or for example, if you have some guesses, or perhaps you have the maiden name and the married name and you don't know what will be on the record, just try a whole range of things and do multiple searches and see if you find anything convincing. I've also added here the birth year, which again I was sure of, so I put exact, but you can add a sort of margin of error onto this. So maybe you know they were born in the 1870s, so you might put 1875 and then plus minus 5 years, because you know it's within that window. And you will want to narrow things down as much as possible, because otherwise you will see you do get a lot of search results. So you do want to try and sort of bring that down so it's easier to sort through. I've also put here the location they lived in, but there is also a field for keywords, and you know, maybe you want to put in their profession or something like that. That one gives you quite a lot of freedom. And again, this is just a bit of experimentation, so trying different things and seeing what comes up, and just sort of trawling through the results sometimes. Though you do have filters on the results, so you should be able to sort of narrow them down. So yeah, here is another part of that form for the search. So you can add family members, so maybe you know their spouse's name or a child's name, and things like their gender or their nationality. Ancestry has records from all around the world. You do have to pay extra to access international records, but if you know that you had a family member who was from or who lived in a different country, might be worth putting that country in and trying to find records in other places. And this is what the results page may look like. So you're going to have sort of lots of results that you might want to start narrowing down. One kind of result you might get are other Ancestry members' family trees. And these can be very useful. Sometimes I've found people with shared relatives, and I've been able to find records on their trees that are things I've been searching for or are relevant to what I'm doing. Sometimes I've even found photographs that I've been quite sure are the people, which has been really cool. But you should have some caution with this, because it is possible that other Ancestry members have put wrong information in their trees. I've seen that plenty of times before, where something hasn't quite added up, and I've been able to sort of look through and realize that they've gone wrong somewhere. And if I would have just added all of their records or added all of the links that they had, my family tree would have then been wrong. So it's definitely worth really investigating their stuff too. It can be a good resource for things, but definitely don't just trust other people's family trees. And then the other thing you're going to see on that page are these filters. So essentially what you can do is start narrowing down the kinds of records and where they are. So for example, you can see here under this filters section, it tells you the number of results that are that type. So for example, in the record location, you can see there are over 30,000 records here for Europe. If I were to click on Europe, it would then narrow down to different countries in Europe and tell me how many from each country. And so for example, here, if I was searching Alfred Thomas Hyder, as you can see, I knew that he lived his whole life in England, so I would narrow that down to England most likely, to try and sort of bring down that huge number, because I can't look through 30,000 plus records, of course. And again, I would have known a vague range of years that I would expect to find records about him in, and so again, I can go through and I can narrow those down like that. And sometimes you might just want to look at every type of record, or you might be specifically searching for a census or specifically looking for a marriage certificate. And in those cases, it could be useful just to narrow down to those records to save yourself a bit of time. So some sort of things to look out for while you're doing this detective work are, first of all, surnames can change. They often did, because I mean people remarry, so then their surname may change. But also people used to misspell their surnames a lot. So census to census, maybe it was spelt Hyder with a Y and then it was spelt Hyder with an I. And also, I mean, as I showed you earlier, families can just switch between surnames. So this was the case in my family tree with the Hills and the Hyders. We're still not completely clear on why they did this. I still haven't gotten to the bottom of that. However, it's clear that they do. And you can actually see here in a military record that it even says John Henry Hyder and then in brackets Elias Hills. So clearly they went by both names. Again, a bit of a mystery, but I could have easily discounted, say, the Hyders or the Hills because they didn't match up, but actually they're the same people. Also, people move. So one way that you can have a look for this is on censuses. Maybe someone's living in Brighton, but you might see their birthplace was London. So now you know when you look for their birth certificate, you need to look elsewhere. And it's definitely worth thinking about this as well. If someone's disappeared from the censuses, what's happened to them? I mean, you could look for a death certificate because maybe they've passed away, but it's also worth thinking that they might have moved. So you might want to say, go on the search tool and type in everything you know about them up until then, and then look in other places than where you've seen them before. One way that I was able to find that someone had moved was actually by looking at school records. So I was able to see that they had been living down in Brighton area, and then I was able to trace them to a school in London, and I was able to see they was the same people because it was the same ages, and it even had said where they had moved from. All the same names, and actually I found that one of the family members had moved in with another family member, and so I was able to link them that way as well. So here you can see that you've got Edmund and William Parsons, who are brothers, but now they're in London. One is living with Amelia Parsons, their mother, and the other is living around the corner with someone called Jessie Brooker. And Jessie Brooker, as it turned out, was actually Amelia's sister. And once I found that out, it was a really strong link that all of these people were the same. And it sort of told their story a little bit as well. And also, records may be written inaccurately. People sometimes would give the wrong year that they were born, or maybe they filled out a census for a household and someone was busy and then someone else gave their details and did it wrong. So it is worth remembering that just because something doesn't add up, don't completely write it off. Do consider if it could have been a mistake, but I mean, also, if there are too many mistakes, you should start to consider it might not be the same person. Also, names can be passed down through generations, of course. It can be a useful thing to look at, because I wouldn't base a decision on whether, say, a census is for the right family or not on if they've, say, got a new son who's got the name of the grandfather or something. But it could be a clue, especially if someone had a more unusual name that's been passed down. It might be a way to at least find the record and then try and confirm it other ways. Also, Ancestry can have spelling errors, so something Ancestry will do is it will sort of automatically transcribe what's in the records, and that's often what it uses to try and link up the information you've given it with its records. But it can sometimes misread things. A lot of these records are handwritten and Ancestry doesn't always understand the handwriting. So I've seen it before where names are completely different. There was a record for someone whose name was Susan, but it was written as Desan. Completely different name. And at first I could have thought, oh, that's not the same person, but instead I clicked and I zoomed in on the record and I read it myself and I saw it said Susan. So do look at the records, do look at the actual scans of the records, not just what Ancestry has written. And another thing you might find on Ancestry, which is a really nice thing to find, are photos. I have found some photos on Ancestry before. It can be difficult to work out whether this is really your family member, because what you have to remember is that these photos are just added by other members on Ancestry, so you don't really have any way to know where they got them from. I mean, you can message people on Ancestry, you can ask them. I sometimes look at the file names, so when people upload photos to Ancestry, they give them some kind of name. And sometimes I found that that can be quite convincing because, for example, if it says like Auntie Sue or something, then it kind of tells you that the person who uploaded this photo probably personally knew the person and would have known that they linked to the person in their tree. So you could probably trust that photo more. I have also found it where there's been a picture of a person and then the name is like stock photo of Milkman or something like that. And then, of course, I know straight away, okay, that's not my family member at all. And then there's some things in the middle where it's just not possible to tell. And sometimes I save the photos but take them with a pinch of salt, and sometimes I don't. It really sort of depends how I'm feeling. But ultimately, you're not really taking any information from this to actually build your family tree, so it won't really affect you in that way. So it's really just down to what you want to do. So something else that you can technically do on Ancestry, but I will say it's not really set up for it, is that you can find out who lived in your home. And the best way to do this on Ancestry is to just type in your street address into the search with no other information, and then look through records to try and find the census for your street. This has varying amounts of success. I have managed to find things on Ancestry about who lived in my house before, but it doesn't always show up results. It can't always link them together so well. So if you really want to know who lived in your house before, your best bet is probably to go over to the Keep, which is sort of over in Falmouth direction, and look through the records there. I think there may be a fee to become a member at the Keep, but it is a really good centre for records. And I mean, in general, for if you're looking for local records or even advice on finding those records, the Keep can help you with that. which can be an easier way because you can just look through the censuses and find your street. But it is possible to do this on Ancestry sometimes. And essentially the way this works is just like with the censuses where before with your family members maybe you were looking for the names, instead you're just looking for the street, which is of course on this left hand column of the census. And while Ancestry can give you lots and lots of information about your family history, there's a lot of information outside of Ancestry as well. And I don't mean necessarily on other family tree building websites, but I mean just on Google, on random blogs. There can be some interesting stuff to find. And as one example of this, I mean, I've already touched on military records. You can find them on Ancestry, but there are other sources that you can look for things on. So if you want to find a war grave, you can go to this website here. You can scan this QR code, or I've put the link here. So this is the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and if you have the military number and the name of your relative, you may be able to find a war grave on this website for them. But also, to be honest, just Googling a name and a military number is worth doing. I found information this way as well. I can't necessarily say what you'll find because often it can be quite random websites, which obviously you should, think about whether they're trustworthy. But in general, there are other places you can find information. So I actually found a website where someone was offering, I think it cost £5, and they lived around the war graves, and they would go and take photos of your family members' war graves in France. And I was able to get a family member's war grave photo that way. But it's essentially just seeing what you find. So I wanted to give an example of something that I did outside of Ancestry, just looking for information online. Some information I had was about my great-grandfather from Spain. So my auntie had found records that told us his full name, Amalio Palacios Linares, and also like his date of birth, where he was living in Spain, where he was born, things like that. And something my nan had told me was that he was an inventor, and that he had invented something to do with measuring fabric, she had said, but she didn't know exactly what, and we hadn't been able to find any more information. With the information from the records my auntie had found, I started to do a bit of digging. And what I googled was something along the lines of his name, and then the words like inventor and fabric, but in Spanish. And I basically just went through search results, and I found this, it was a PDF that I opened that was plans for a museum in Spain and for the layout, and it had his name in it and something to do with fabric or something. So I then sort of read through, translated this document from Spanish, and I was able to find that this was a plan for an exhibit on famous inventors from Spain, from that area. And so going through, I then found that he was one of the exhibits. So I'd found him and his invention. So I thought, wow, that's really cool. This is a bit of information about him. And then I actually looked up their website. So the exhibit then, was built and was in the museum. And so I was able to go to the website for that museum. And they had like a sort of 3D virtual tour you could take of their museum. You sort of clicked arrows and moved around, and so I virtually walked around the exhibit in the museum until I found this. So these are screenshots from my virtual tour, and it had the photo of, the drawing of him up at the museum, and then I was able to find as well the patent. So I found on it was like the Spanish Register of Patents. I was able to look up the name of his invention and then find the patent, which had all of his technical drawings, which was really cool. And then later on, just again Googling all of the information that I had, I found a Facebook post from a Spanish history Facebook page that had more information about him. So it was just essentially Googling keywords. And one tip for doing this, when you Google things, you can use plus and minus signs to tell Google what to do with words. If you put a plus sign directly in front of a word, it will only give you results that definitely contain that word somewhere on their page or in their title. If you use a minus next to a word, it will exclude those words from the search results. And say you might want to do that, like if you had a family member who had the same name as a celebrity, let's say you had a family member who had the same name as a famous singer, what you might want to do is type in your family member's name if you were, say, Googling for information about them, and then put minus and then singer or minus music to try and get rid of all of the search results about the celebrity, for example. So those are just some tricks on using Google more efficiently for looking for this kind of information. And actually, Google can give you quite a lot of different kinds of information. So one thing I like to use Google for is just looking up addresses on Google Maps. You can get addresses of your family members, of course, from the censuses, and you can then look up these addresses and actually go and look at the houses sometimes that your family members lived in, and take a little walk around, see what they would have seen. Of course, sometimes buildings have changed or been torn down, and so you won't always see exactly the same house, but it can be interesting, and sometimes it is the same house. So here in Arnold Street, I think this is the same building that my great-grandfather lived in. It's probably been painted since, but other than that, this was where he lived. But actually, even if the house has been demolished, something that you could try and do is look for other sources other than Google Maps. So I found this website before, My Brighton and Hove, and I managed to find Cambridge Street, where one of my relatives had been living, and they had lots of old photos of the street before new buildings had been built. And so this was really nice to be able to find this and see how it was back then. I just found this by Googling Cambridge Street, Brighton, and this came up. So essentially you may not find the information, it might not be out there, but that's again how I find this. I just Google things, really. Another thing you might want to use Google for is working out sort of extra information about your family members. So for example, here I'd found a family member who their job was listed as page boy picture theatre, and I had no idea what that meant. So I did a bit of Googling of what this meant, and it turned out that it meant he essentially worked at a cinema, and he would wear sort of a board on him, and it would have adverts for the film. So he was essentially a movie trailer before they had movie trailers, which is quite interesting. But then I thought, well, okay, I know where he lived, and at the time it was sort of the emergence of cinema, so there can't have been that many cinemas in the area. So I was able to look at an old map of the area in London that he lived in, and I was able to find a cinema just nearby him. And I did a little bit of digging into that cinema, and it turned out it's one of the oldest cinemas in the UK. And so it was really cool to know that one of the first cinemas opening in the UK, my relative was there, sort of, advertising the films. And I got that context just by looking at information on Google. So I wasn't even Googling specifically my family member. I was just looking up information about the kind of job that he would have done. And you could do this with any job. I once found a family member who made stockings, and I looked up a little bit of the process of that, what they would have been doing day to day. And it's just very interesting. And then just to finish up, what might you like to do with this information? Of course, it's just interesting to know your family history and to share it with, say, other family members or friends, and just sort of know a little bit about where you came from. But just as a suggestion, something you can do is put these things together in like a little book. So this is something I did for my partner's parents for a Christmas present. So I'd been looking into their family history, and so I wanted to be able to sort of give them all of that information. And the way I did that was I basically made this little book with pages on each of their relatives. So essentially I've got a video here, and you can see sort of as the pages go through. It's got a little bit about parents, and then sort of the most interesting records I found, grandparents, and then sort of goes back like that, and just has all of the information for them. It's a nice way to sort of keep things together, because you may find that you save lots of censuses and you get a bit confused as to who's who. And it's a nice keepsake to have. I just got this printed online, and I used one of the censuses to make a decoration for the cover, and it was a nice way to put everything together. So thank you for listening. Hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, you can always get it. Yeah, with that, thank you.